The Metroid Prime Trilogy is 3 of the best games ever made. These incredible space adventures are full of action, atmosphere, and amazing moments. Playing through these games for the first time over the past couple months has been fantastic. These 3 legendary games consistently impressed me around every corner with the environments, creatures, boss fights, and upgrades. I'd heard nothing but good things about the Prime games over the years, but for one reason or another I never got around to playing them myself. After playing and loving all of the 2D Metroid games, I decided it was finally time to dive into the Prime series. So I downloaded the Metroid Prime Trilogy and played through all 3 games, and I have a lot to say about them. And with the recently released Metroid Prime Remastered being in the spotlight, and Metroid Prime 4 still on the horizon, there's no better time to cover this trilogy of games. Now, I went into these games knowing basically nothing about them, which is probably why I had such strong experiences with them. So while this video won't be getting into any heavy spoilers, as I'll only be using footage from the first half of each game, I'd still suggest you go in as blind as possible if you've never played them before. It was an absolute delight to enter each new area not knowing what to expect, and being surprised by every new room. So try to get that experience for yourself if you can. Now let's get into my review of the Metroid Prime Trilogy, and why these 3 games have quickly become some of my favorite video games of all time. For the original Metroid Prime, I'll be using footage from the brand new remaster, but keep in mind that my first playthrough of this game was actually on the Wii version a couple months ago. I'm just using my remastered gameplay because it's all shiny and pretty to look at, even though it kind of clashes with the other 2 games' lower resolution visuals. This new upgraded release is pretty convenient timing for me, since this video has already been in production for a couple weeks now, and they really knocked it out of the park with this remaster. I think it's easily one of the best looking games on Switch. Since I played the Wii Trilogy collection first, I used the motion controls for all 3, and I actually really like the way this setup feels. You point around the screen using the Wii remote to aim, and it's surprisingly intuitive and feels great to use. The new remaster still has these pointer controls as an option, but they feel a lot less precise since there's no sensor bar. But Remastered also introduces dual stick controls with gyro aiming, which also feels terrific to use. So I really don't know which control style I like the best, but that's a pretty good problem to have. Now let's get into talking about each game individually. I think all 3 of these games are great in their own way, and each one has something unique to offer. Let's start with the one that brought the series into 3D for the first time, Metroid Prime. Probably the first thing you'll notice about the gameplay of Metroid Prime is that it's from a first-person perspective, where you look at the world from the viewpoint of Samus's helmet. From what I've heard, this was a pretty controversial decision when it was first revealed, since it's such a drastic departure from the classic 2D games. But it turns out that a first-person perspective was the perfect way to translate Metroid into 3D. The core gameplay of getting lost in the depths of an alien world is better than ever here thanks to the 3D environments, and that special Metroid atmosphere is even stronger. First person allows the game to feel even more immersive, so the scary parts of the game are super effective. One of the most impressive elements of this game are the environments and how highly detailed everything is. Whether you're exploring the dusty ancient halls of Chozo ruins or the dark lava-filled caves of Magmore Caverns, this game always looks stunning. It looked impressive back on the GameCube in 2002, and the 2023 remaster brings it to a whole new level of visual beauty. I especially love when mist, raindrops, or alien guts show up on your visor, or how you can see Samus's eyes briefly flash in the reflection of the visor when an explosion happens in the dark. These are such cool details that really put you in Samus's shoes. There's such a good flow to the gameplay that sometimes I forget to slow down and just appreciate all the tiny details in the environment. On a similar note, one of the main features of the gameplay is scanning, where you can scan basically anything in the world around you to learn more about it. There's detailed information on creatures, plants, bosses, and plenty of lore. This is a genius way to let the player learn more about the world naturally. The people who are super interested in all that stuff can spend time poring over every scannable object, learning everything there is to know about Talon 4. And if you're not as interested, it's totally optional. Personally, I loved scanning pretty much everything, as it gave the world a new sense of realism, since there's an explanation behind everything. Reading lots of lore text is only fun when I'm the one who wants to do it, instead of being required by the game itself, which Metroid Prime totally understands. I honestly hope more games do this sort of thing, as it's an amazing way to put the world building right into the gameplay. This storytelling technique allows Metroid Prime to have a totally hands-off approach to its narrative, where there's basically no direct involvement of anyone other than the player. Scanning stuff is also a great way to naturally explain the environmental puzzles and boss fights without feeling forced. There is a basic hint system in the game, but it only intrudes on your gameplay when you're really lost. In my first playthrough, I ended up in the underwater wreckage of the frigate before I was supposed to, and once I'd reached a certain point, the game gave me a simple message to head somewhere else. But if you're on the right path and going in the correct direction, the game stays out of your way and lets you discover everything for yourself. I think this is the perfect way to have a hint system, and you can always turn it off if you want absolutely no help at all. This game can be somewhat confusing to navigate at times, but checking every door and retracing your steps is all part of the Metroid experience. And since it's up to you and your map reading skills to figure out where to go, these locations end up feeling even more real and memorable. It feels pretty great once you finally have it all down and start effortlessly traversing through the world. Of course, there's an upgrade progression system that gradually unlocks as you go, with each new item giving you more options for traversal and combat. Interesting combinations like freezing an enemy and then shooting them with a missile to shatter them is a super cool way to make the combat feel more fun. Speaking of combat, let's talk about that. The main difference between this game's combat and other first-person shooters is the lock-on feature. At any time you can lock onto an enemy, meaning that aiming isn't actually super important. Instead, the focus is on reading enemy attack patterns and dodging out of the way. Enemies don't take turns to attack you, so being able to lock on really helps during the more frantic encounters. Fighting enemies feels really satisfying once you get used to it. Dashing and weaving in and out of oncoming attacks and firing back with beam shots and missiles feels fantastic. On the Wii, the lock-on feature was a little finicky and didn't always work right, but I think that's just due to the Z button on the nunchuck, because it works perfectly in the new remaster. I will say that it took me a while to get used to the dash, since you can only dash side to side and not forward and backward, but after a while I got it down, and it's actually really nice that you can still jump while locked onto an enemy by moving forward. Things can get pretty tough at times, so you'll really have to keep a close eye on your energy to not end up with a game over screen. There's no better feeling than finally finding a save room after wandering around on low health. There are some pretty great boss fights, requiring the perfect amount of multitasking between shooting and trying to figure out how to take them down. Throughout pretty much the whole game, it always feels like you're outmatched, which makes succeeding feel even better. I knew going into this game that there was a long backtracking quest at the end of the game, so collecting all the Chozo artifacts didn't feel too bad to me since I was expecting it, but I can see how it would be annoying if you didn't know that was required before getting to the final boss. And I have to talk about the soundtrack. The music and sound design of Metroid Prime are incredible. The songs are mostly focused on the vibe and atmosphere, which is perfect when combined with the natural sounds of the planet around you. The light piano notes of Phendrana Drifts, the epic low chanting choir of Magmore Caverns, and the beautiful ambience of the downed frigate Orpheon. The music adds so much to the experience. It's an essential part of what makes this game so good. And the sound effects of the creatures, environments, and combat all sound terrific. All of it is just perfect. When it comes to a series' transition into 3D, I think Metroid might have done it the very best with Prime. Everything that's good about Metroid is preserved and enhanced with this adventure, and given a whole new level of immersion and scale. People often call Metroid Prime one of the greatest games ever made, and I think it absolutely deserves that praise. I'm so glad the new remaster can bring this experience to a whole new audience, and that it looks as good as it does. But believe it or not, it doesn't stop there. Just a few years later, a sequel was released, Metroid Prime 2: Echoes. Being a sequel to one of the best games of all time instantly puts a lot of pressure on this game, but I think it definitely holds up. Right off the bat, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes is a darker and more mature game than its predecessor, which was already pushing the boundary for what's usually included in Nintendo games. Within the first couple minutes, you encounter countless bodies of Federation troopers, with some of them hanging from the ceiling upside down, and the scanning descriptions of how they died are equally horrifying. The story, world, and gameplay of Prime 2 all have a much darker tone. This is a fight to save a planet that's on the brink of being destroyed by its darker twin, and your arrival is the last chance the Luminoff have to save their home. It's fascinating to slowly learn how everything went so wrong, and finding corpses littered across the land with descriptions of how they fought to survive is haunting and grim. I love how pretty much everyone you talk to is already dead, and it's up to you to fulfill their dying wishes. Out of all the planets featured in the Prime games, I had the strongest emotional connection to Aether because of the narrative. I may prefer the first game when it comes to visuals and world design, but Prime 2 easily has the better story and lore. Dark Samus is a great mysterious antagonist, and every time she showed up was intense and exciting. I also like that your goal is clear and established from the very start, and you're working towards that goal constantly. I can totally understand why someone might prefer the narrative style of Prime 1, but personally I really enjoyed having more direct involvement in the story. This game takes place on a totally separate planet, and that means a brand new map to explore. It's super impressive that they managed to make all the areas of this game feel fresh and unique when compared to the first game. Nothing feels reused or unoriginal. Each section of the map felt unlike anything I had seen before, with interesting themes like the dark and swampy depths of Torvis Bog or the high-tech hallways of Sanctuary Fortress. There's also a lot more wide open spaces in the environments, which is a welcome improvement. Aether feels like a totally different beast than Talon 4, which is just how it should be. And of course the soundtrack is fantastic as well, with the same amazing atmosphere that the original had while still feeling distinct. The way the Torvis Bog Catacombs music remixes the lower Brinstar theme from Super Metroid is just incredible. This game has the same amazing attention to detail as the original, with plenty of things to scan, lore to find, and interesting objects to interact with. The environments are full of awesome stuff like the sky changing depending on whether or not you've restored that area's planetary energy, or blue sparks floating in the air just before Dark Samus attacks. One detail I love is how looking directly into beams of light will mess up Samus's vision for a bit. The core gameplay of Prime 2 feels the same, but the big new feature is having an evil dark version of the map that you have to traverse through. The dark world has toxic air that immediately damages you, so you have to quickly rush between these safe spots to not instantly die. This makes the combat even more challenging and scary in the dark world, since you don't have as much space to move around in. Eventually you get an upgraded suit that helps you take less damage, which is one of the most satisfying upgrades ever. And I won't spoil it here, but Samus's final power suit in this game is probably her coolest one ever, and easily my favorite look she's ever had. Switching between the dark and light versions of the map makes the exploration even more confusing at times, since you now have two maps to keep track of at the same time. The bigger and more complex areas can make it hard to use the 3D map, especially when multiple layers start getting introduced on top of each other. But weirdly, I never got frustrated when I got lost or ended up in the wrong place. It just made me feel even more immersed into the world, like I was really all alone on an alien planet just trying to survive. I guess that's how you know I've become a true Metroid fan. I now enjoy getting lost and confused. There's also some new elements like the light and dark beams, which have a limited ammo supply. Having to manage your light and dark ammo adds even more to the overall oppressive atmosphere. And while it was kind of annoying and I wouldn't really want this mechanic to come back in future games, I think it works here. The whole point of the dark world is to feel scary and threatening, and not having an infinite supply of powerful shots makes things feel even more desperate. Towards the end of the game, the difficulty really starts to ramp up too, and you'll have to use everything in your power to take down the enemies in your path. I'm still scared of these giant alien shark things that charge at you, and these weird tumbleweed ball things in the dark world might just be the most annoying video game enemies ever. There are some incredibly impressive boss fights that have an amazing sense of scale, but man, who thought Morph Ball boss fights was a good idea? These fights felt more tedious than challenging, although they got a lot easier on replays once I learned that you can shake to jump in Morph Ball form, which I was not aware of until after I beat all 3 games. Prime 2 also had a split-screen multiplayer mode with unique maps, which is a really cool offering to see in a single-player game. Luckily, this mode is more of a fun distraction and doesn't take away anything from the main single-player story. Overall, Prime 2 takes everything that worked about the first game and improves upon it. This game feels very similar to Majora's Mask to me, where it takes the gameplay and formula of a masterpiece and gives it a darker twist, focusing on a strong, tragic narrative and game mechanics that might feel frustrating, but add to the overall theming. I loved Metroid Prime 1, but strangely, Prime 2 is where I got really hooked and invested in everything. The rich atmosphere, engaging combat, and unique music were all just as good in the sequel as they were in the original, and this game managed to tell a great new story on top of all of that. It seems like Echoes is a little bit divisive online, since its frustrating gameplay can be a lot to manage, which I totally get. But for me, I absolutely loved this game, and it stands next to the first one as an impressively crafted adventure full of great moments. There was a much bigger time gap between this one and the next game, since the Metroid Prime formula had to be brought over to a whole new console. This game brought a lot of changes, some good and some bad. Let's get into Metroid Prime 3, Corruption. Prime 3 had a difficult task. It had to be a worthy follow-up to the first 2 amazing games, while still being accessible enough that the casual Wii audience could jump in for the first time. And overall, I think it did a pretty good job accomplishing both. It makes a couple sacrifices here and there, and the story is presented a lot differently, but I still love this game from start to finish. The narrative has a much more hands-on approach, similar to other story-based games. There's a tutorial with guided NPC interaction, and people telling you what to do basically every step of the way. It seems a lot of people didn't really like this, and I can totally see why, but it didn't really bother me. I guess I'm just used to this sort of stuff in games. Although it is a bit strange to see it be included in a Metroid Prime game, which are usually so quiet and reserved when it comes to the story. This time there are multiple full-on characters, complete with voice lines and important story moments. I really liked the 3 different bounty hunters you run into. Your interactions with them are short and sweet while still being memorable. What I wasn't a big fan of were the Aurora units, which basically only exist to deliver story exposition and tell you what to do. There's always a clear objective room marked on the map, and the hint system sometimes interrupted my gameplay when I was already on the right path. You can almost feel how scared the developers are that new players will get lost or annoyed. This game is a strange mix of feeling both larger in scale than the previous entries, but also more linear and restricted when it comes to the world designs. Right from the opening set piece you can tell that the budget is much higher, making things feel a lot more cinematic. The pirate attack on the Federation frigate is an amazing spectacle, and from there the game just keeps expanding to new planets and locations, instead of spending the whole game on just one planet. Each new place I landed kept impressing me with how good a Wii game can look. The art design and sense of awe is as strong as always. The flying city of Skytown Elysia is seriously one of my new favorite video game locations of all time. But an unfortunate side effect of having so many different planets in one game is that they all feel a lot smaller and less fleshed out than Talon 4 or Aether. The paths are pretty small and linear, so there's less chance of the player getting confused and lost, but there's also less chances to explore and discover, so it's an interesting give and take. Because on one hand, this sort of expansion of the Metroid universe is really cool. I love seeing so many different planets and having this cool space map, but it does take away some of the feelings that the first 2 games had, where you get lost in the darkest corners of one planet. Prime 3 feels more like Samus is just briefly visiting each location instead of really diving deep into each one. It sounds like a bad thing, but I actually think it's fine. Instead of looking at this new style of gameplay as a threat to the old type, I prefer to see it as something new and different that can be enjoyed alongside the previous games. All this space travel means you spend a lot more time around Samus's gunship, which is fine by me. The gunship is also implemented into the gameplay more than ever before. You can decide where it lands, order it to fly in for an airstrike, and there are even a few upgrades throughout the game that give the gunship new abilities. Having the gunship be so close to Samus at all times does take away a little bit of the isolation, but it feels pretty cool to hop in the cockpit and take off to another planet. These loading screens where you watch Samus travel around in various different vehicles are great. They give the world that larger sense of scale that I talked about earlier. And I can't believe I made it this far without talking about the motion controls. The Wii Remote pointing controls that I used in all 3 games were first introduced in Prime 3, and they're fantastic. It's a whole new level of precision aiming, and it feels effortless to use. You can also shake the nunchuck to use your grapple beam to rip apart parts of the environment or pull away enemy shields. It feels pretty good when it works, but every once in a while I had to pull the nunchuck back multiple times to get it to do what I wanted. This game uses motion controls in lots of little bits here and there, like selecting stuff in the cockpit of the gunship, twisting the remote to solve simple puzzle locks, or removing energy cells by pulling the Wii Remote out. I was totally fine with these inclusions, but I'm a big fan of motion controls in general, so I guess that's not surprising. I like how they give the objects of the world a tactile feeling, like you're more personally interacting with the machines around you. But I can see how the same repeated puzzles would get old to some people after a while. Alongside the motion controls, another big focus of this game is Hyper Mode. By holding down plus, you enter into a super powerful state where your shots do huge damage, but comes at the cost of your energy life. I thought this was an interesting idea, but sometimes it made combat feel a little too easy. If there was a big, tough enemy in my path, I'd simply turn on Hyper Mode and take them out in a few shots. The Metroids are a lot less scary in this game than they were in the previous 2, since Hyper Mode takes them out instantly. I'd often force myself to not use Hyper Mode during combat just so things felt more interesting and exciting, but you can only stay in it for a couple seconds and it does take a lot of your energy, so it's not like it totally breaks the game or anything. And it does feel pretty good to use it at the perfect time in a boss fight and absolutely destroy them. Towards the end of the game, there's a similar sort of backtracking quest that the first 2 had, where you have to collect a certain amount of energy cells. I'm totally fine with this sort of backtracking since it doesn't bother me very much, but for some reason there are multiple branching paths that require energy cells. And unless I'm missing something, there's no way to tell which way is the important story direction and which one just leads to an item. I really didn't like that, as I kept choosing the wrong way and wasting valuable energy cells. But at least the vibe and aesthetic of this location is great, proving that Prime 3 can still make those scary horror sections. And it probably goes without saying that the soundtrack is amazing as well. Some of the boss fight themes in particular sound terrific. Even though I've complained about a couple things here and there, I still love Metroid Prime 3. Prime 1 and 2 feel like two parts of the same experience to me, where Prime 3 goes off in a different direction. The larger story and world felt super epic, and I enjoyed the narrative despite it being so different. It also does a great job at wrapping up the Phazon and Dark Samus plotline that runs through the whole trilogy. I think there's probably a perfect middle ground between what Prime 3 is trying to do and the structure of the first two, and I think this game is an important step for evolving the series and continuing to innovate. I know there are people who probably would have preferred this game just do the same thing the GameCube games did, but I'm actually glad it tried something totally new. Not all of it worked, but the stuff that did is worth it to me. This game managed to feel like something fresh while still keeping that core Metroid Prime gameplay that works so well, and I think it's a worthy finale despite a few missteps. And those are my thoughts on all three games from the Metroid Prime trilogy. Like I said at the beginning, these games have quickly become some of my all-time favorites, and I'm so glad I finally played them. The first-person perspective combined with the terrific music makes these some of the most immersive Nintendo games ever made. Each one of these games managed to feel unique, with different locations and atmospheres, narrative structures and story moments, and gameplay mechanics that make them feel distinct. These three games are so great, and altogether they make for one incredibly memorable and enjoyable experience. Overall, it took me around 50 hours to beat all three, and that's not counting how many times I'll replay each one, so it's an insanely good value for $20 on the Wii U eShop. Apparently, the entire Prime series takes place between Metroid 1 and 2 of the main series, which feels a little weird to me. I think I'd honestly prefer them to be in their own separate universe rather than trying to fit them awkwardly into the timeline like that. But I'm so glad that the Prime series isn't ending here. The new remaster is bringing the series back into the public eye, and I'm sure Prime 4 will be amazing whenever it eventually comes out. I hope that Prime 2 and 3 end up getting remasters on the Switch as well, since they're just as deserving and are important parts of the series that people shouldn't miss out on. I had already become a fan of Metroid thanks to the 2D games, but the Prime trilogy has cemented Metroid near the very top of my favorite gaming franchises, and I can't wait to see where this series goes next. As always, be sure to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Whether you just got into this series with the new remaster or are a lifetime fan, tell me what you think about the Metroid Prime games. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see ya in the next one.